Okay, welcome. Um, I'm Brian Vermeer, and for the next few weeks, we're going to be looking at the life of the prophet Daniel. Daniel is a popular book. Most people know about Daniel in the lion's den, but there's certainly a whole lot more to the book of Daniel than just that story. First of all, we need to understand a little bit about the context of the book. Daniel is included in the prophetic works of the Bible because Daniel was a prophet. Now, first, let's understand just exactly what a prophet was. Most of the time, when we think of a prophet, we think of a person who tells the future. Well, in the Bible, that's not just what a prophet does. Although Daniel certainly does tell about the future in the second half of his book, a prophet in the Old Testament was a person who received a message from God and would give that message to the people. That is, his message would start off with something like, God said to me, or thus saith the Lord. Remember, at this time, the Bible had not been compiled yet. There were very few books that had been set down in written form. About the only thing the Jewish people had at the time were the 5 books of Moses. So, in order to receive any message from God, God had to directly speak to someone, and that person would then give the message to the people, and that person was known as a prophet. And Daniel certainly was a prophet, and his prophecies comprise the second half of his book. In the historical context, we need to look at the Babylonian conquest of Israel. The Babylonian Empire, centered in the city of Babylon, which is in modern day Iraq, started conquering or, or started a siege of the kingdom of Judah, that is the southern half of the whole kingdom of Israel, around the year 600 BC. And actually, about 605 BC is when Nebuchadnezzar, one of the kings of Babylon at that time, began attacking the city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem would be completely destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BC. That is about a 20-year siege. Jerusalem was under attack by the forces of Babylon. One of Nebuchadnezzar's policies to prevent future uprisings against his kingdom and against his empire was to assimilate the culture that he had just conquered into the culture of Babylon. That is, the best way to destroy a nation is to take away that nation's identity as a people. So when he would conquer a nation, he would take captives from that nation and have them moved to Babylon. And he would take some Babylonians and have them moved into the new nation, hoping that the Babylonians would intermarry with the ones he had just conquered, and pretty soon you would have a completely mixed culture. The culture that had been there before would be completely destroyed over time. No one would remember any of the old ways. They would all become Babylonians. Daniel was probably taken to Jerusalem during the first deportation of Jews to Babylon, which occurred in 605 BC. Daniel was a very young man at this time, but had already shown some intelligence. In the first chapter of the book of Daniel, which is what we're going to be reading from today, we see that Daniel and 3 of his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, are included in this group taken to Babylon, probably because they were very intelligent, and once there, they were enrolled in Babylonian schools and were going to be raised to become advisors to the government of Babylon. Another way of assimilating the Hebrews into the Babylonian culture was to give them Babylonian names. And in Daniel chapter 1, we see that Daniel's name was changed to the Babylonian name Belteshazzar. Hananiah's name was changed to Shadrach. Mishael's name was changed to Meshach. And Azariah's name was changed to Abednego. So they were given these Babylonian names, hoping that that would help them become part of the Babylonian culture, and they would now consider themselves Babylonian instead of Hebrew. It's a testament to the Jewish nation, and it's a sign that God is protecting and preserving the Jewish nation simply in the fact that the Jewish nation did not assimilate into Babylonian culture. The Jewish nation kept their identity. They refused to intermarry with the Babylonians, at least not to any great extent. They kept their Jewish ways, they kept their Jewish beliefs, and then 70 years later, when they were released, they still had their religion. They still knew who their priests were. They still knew their kings, everything they would need to know in order to go back to Judah and set up their government again. They had not become part of the Babylonian. However, that can't be said for the Jews that remained behind in Israel during this time. Many of those Jews did intermarry with the Babylonians, and since the Jewish temple was destroyed, even though they kept their religion, they set up their own place of worship in the area which is later known as Samaria. And these are the group that would later become known as the Samaritans. And this is why in the New Testament we see such a hatred between the Jewish people and the Samaritan people, because the Jewish people looked at the Samaritans as mixed breed, as not pure Jewish. And since they didn't use the temple in Jerusalem, therefore they weren't worshiping God correctly. And that's why that animosity developed. But going back to Daniel, again, we're looking at Daniel chapter 1. And first we're going to look at verses 3 through 5. We're going to see what happened to Daniel and his friends when they were taken to Babylon. Beginning in verse 3, it says, "The king ordered Ashpenaz, the king of his court officials, to bring some of the Israelites from the royal family and from the nobility, young men without any physical defect, good-looking, suitable for instruction in all wisdom, knowledgeable, perceptive, and capable of serving in the king's palace, and to teach them the Chaldean language and literature. The king assigned them daily provisions from the royal food and from the wine that he drank. They were to be trained for 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to serve in the king's court." So here's why Daniel and his friends were taken. They were shown that they had wisdom, they were knowledgeable, perceptive, capable of serving in the king's palace. That is, they were among the smartest of the young Jewish men. Nebuchadnezzar thought they would be probably the easiest to convert. Since they were young, he probably felt they weren't as set in their ways as the older ones would be. So they would be easier to change over to Babylonian, or as we see in the verse here, Chaldean. The two terms are pretty much synonymous into their culture. So in verse 5, we see that the king provided them provisions from the royal food and the wine. He's preparing them to serve in the royal court. So he is serving them the food that they would receive in the royal court. In verse 4, we see that they were being taught the Chaldean language and their literature. They were being taught all the customs of the Babylonians. They were being taught the literature of the Babylonians, the history of the Babylonians. Everything that they would need to know to become good citizens of Babylon and to become good advisors and workers in the king's palace. This food that they were given probably did not meet all of the dietary laws that were given to Moses for the Jewish people. Because as we look here in verses 8 through 13, we're going to see that Daniel has an objection to some of this training that he is receiving. Let's look at those verses 8 through 13. Daniel determined that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. So he asked permission from the chief official not to defile himself. God had granted Daniel favor and compassion from the chief official, yet he said to Daniel, "My lord the king assigned your food and drink. I'm afraid of what would happen if he saw your faces looking thinner than those of the other young men your age. You would endanger my life with the king." So Daniel said to the guard, whom the chief official had assigned to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then examine our appearance and the appearance of the young men who are eating the king's food, and deal with your servants based on what you see." Now, this is not an order from God to only eat vegetables and water. Daniel has a legitimate complaint about the food that he is receiving. Daniel was Jewish, and in the law of Moses, there were certain restrictions on the food that Jewish people were allowed to eat. Most of us are familiar with some of these. They were not allowed to eat pork. They were not allowed to eat certain types of rodents, or they weren't allowed to eat carrion birds, and several other types of meat. The food had to be prepared a certain way. You cannot prepare meat products and milk products in the same place. You cannot even serve them together. All the laws that today we know as the kosher laws. Well, certainly the Babylonian chefs weren't preparing the food according to the kosher laws, so Daniel had a problem with this food he was eating. He did not want to break God's law, but at the same time, he did not want to insult the Babylonians as well. He knew he would be living here for a while, so he was going to do his best to follow the rules and get along. But we must remember that when it comes to a decision between obeying the law and obeying God, we must obey God rather than men, as Peter would later say in the book of Acts. Now, if the law does not specifically go against what God has told us to do, then we should obey the law as much as we are able. This doesn't mean that just because we don't agree with the law personally that we should break it. This doesn't mean that we should necessarily protest a law just because we don't agree with it. The law is the law. God tells us to respect the leaders. We don't have to agree with all the laws that are made, but we should not break those laws unless the law directly contradicts God's commands to us. And in this case, it did. Daniel simply asked, "Could you please serve us something else?" He's not trying to cause trouble. He's not staging a huge protest. He's simply asking the chef nicely, "Could you please give us an alternate menu so that we don't have to break the laws that our God has given us?" It said in verse 9 that God granted Daniel favor and compassion from the chief official. This shows that Daniel, didn't raise a big fuss about it. He didn't make a big stink about it. He didn't start a riot. He just simply asked the official kindly, which of course should always be our first means. If there's something that we don't agree with and we ask to be set out of it, then we need to, ask kindly instead of just blatantly, causing problems. In verse 10, we see that the chief official was actually worried for his own life because he was following the king's orders. The king said, "Give them this kind of food because this is what they're going to be getting when they serve in my court. So we need to get them, used to it." So in verse 11 and through verse 13, Daniel proposes a test, a scientific experiment, if you will. He says, "Go ahead and give that food. We're not asking that you give everyone the food. We're not going to make everyone follow the same laws that we wish to follow. We know that not everyone here is Jewish, and we know that even some of the Jews are going to go ahead and eat what you give them anyway. There are some Jews who maybe aren't as strict in their beliefs as Daniel and his friends were. So Daniel's simply saying, look, you don't have to do this for everyone, but for me and my friends, let's just do a little experiment. You give everyone else the food that they're supposed to get. That way you don't get in trouble. But you just give my friends and I vegetables and water. That way we're not breaking any of our dietary laws. We're still eating. We're still going to be getting nourishment. And he says at the end of 10 days, then compare our appearance to the appearance of the others. Now, we don't know what kind of test they were given. Very likely, the others were given very rich meats, fatty foods, things like that. Daniel and his friends, being given just vegetables and water, at the end of the 10 days would probably be in better shape. They would not be as fat. They would not be as unhealthy. So Daniel and his friends would certainly look a lot better. They may have put them through some physical tests at the end. All we know is that at the end of the 10 days that they looked better. So the official decides to give the vegetables and water to everyone because that apparently was a better diet than what they were being fed, a healthier diet at least than what they were being fed. We're going to skip ahead now to verses 17 through 19 to see the result of the test here. It says, God gave these 4 young men knowledge and understanding in every kind of literature and wisdom. Daniel also understood visions and dreams of every kind. At the end of the time that the king had said to present them, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king interviewed them, and among all of them, no one was found equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they began to serve in the king's court. Notice in verse 17, God gave these 4 young men knowledge and understanding in every kind of literature and wisdom. If you are intelligent, God gave you that intelligence. If you have any kind of a talent for anything, God is the one who gave you that talent. And he gave you that talent for a purpose. And that purpose includes to serve him. So we see that God gave Daniel and his friends knowledge and understanding. Daniel and his friends would later become advisors to the king. So they needed knowledge and understanding, and that's what God gave them. They were very intelligent. They were able to read the Babylonian literature and understand it. And they were able to even do more. It says Daniel also understood visions and dreams. We'll see later on in this study that the king would come to Daniel with a dream that he'd had, and Daniel would be able to interpret that dream for him and tell him what that meant. It says they were brought before King Nebuchadnezzar himself. Nebuchadnezzar would have the final say as to who would be the ones serving in his palace, and certainly who would be the ones serving in his own presence. The king could not allow just anyone to be in the throne room with him at any time. So Nebuchadnezzar himself interviewed these students that were brought to him. And it says in verse 19, the king interviewed them, and among all of them, no one was found equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. It's kind of interesting how through the rest of the book, Daniel is continually called by that name, Daniel, which was his Hebrew name. But Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah in the rest of the book are referred to as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which are their Babylonian names. But Daniel's the one who wrote the book, so Daniel can call them whatever he wants to call them. He uses his Hebrew name for himself, but since they were in Babylon, he was probably required to use the Babylonian names for his friends, so that's just what he got used to calling them. So in the rest of the book, that's what he calls them. So they begin to serve in the king's court. God gives you talent, and if you choose to use that talent for God, then God will place you in positions where you can use that talent. Everything we have is given to us by God, physically, mentally, psychologically. Everything that we know is because God allows us to know it, and God allows us to retain it. So we see Daniel had this gift for interpreting dreams and visions. We see that Daniel and his friends had a gift of intelligence, and God gave them that gift, and God placed them in the service of King Nebuchadnezzar. Now, given their own choice, they probably would rather have remained behind in Israel than be serving the king of Babylon who had just conquered Israel. But we don't always get the choice as to where we are or what situation we find ourselves in. What we need to take out of this lesson is that no matter what situation we find ourselves in, and Daniel certainly found himself in an awkward situation. He had been taken hundreds of miles from his home. Basically, he had been kidnapped and forced to go to the palace in Babylon, where he would live the rest of his life. But whatever situation we do find ourselves in, we're there because God is allowing us to be there. And if God is allowing us to be there, God has a reason why he wants us there at that time. And if we're trying to follow God, God gives us talents to use in the situation that we are in. And we need to remember to use our talents to serve God in whatever situation we find ourselves in. Daniel would go on and use his ability to interpret dreams and visions as a way to tell Nebuchadnezzar what God had to say. Now, Nebuchadnezzar, of course, did not believe in Daniel's God, but Daniel used his position as a way to try to reach Nebuchadnezzar and tell him about the one true God. But in doing whatever God has called us to do, we must also not lose sight of our own personal convictions. God has told us certain ways to behave, and just because we find ourselves in the middle of a different culture that is different from the way that we were raised, that doesn't mean we can go back on our spiritual convictions. Right is still right, and wrong is still wrong, no matter where you find yourself. If God has said something is wrong, then that something is wrong, no matter where you are. Daniel could have given in and eaten the food that the king had ordered, but that would have gone against the commands that God had already given him. And God's commands always override the commands of men. We need to obey the law as much as we are able. If there is a law that directly goes against our beliefs, that is a law, not just a law that we disagree with, but a law that actually would force us to do something against God's commands, then we need to do like Daniel did. Before we go out and just start breaking the law, before we go out and start a riot over it, we need to do like Daniel did and try peaceful means of getting the law changed, or at least amended in such a way that we don't have to break God's commands and still follow the law. Daniel went to the advisor and asked that he be an exception to the rule, and the advisor granted it. So, we need to remember to use the talents that God has given us. We need to remember to use those talents to serve God in whatever situation we are in, good or bad. And we need to remember to stick to our convictions as to right and wrong, not according to what man says, but according to what God says, because God is the final authority as to what's right and wrong.